things at hand, are encountered within the world. The being of these beings, handiness, is thus ontologically related to the world and to worldliness. World is always already there, in all things at hand. World is already beforehand together with everything encountered, although not thematically. However, it can also appear in certain ways of dealing with the surrounding world. World is that in terms of which things at hand are at hand for us. How can world let things at hand be encountered? Our analysis showed that what is encountered within the world is freed in its being for heedful circumspection, for taking matters into account. What does this prior freeing mean, and how is it to be understood as the ontological distinction of the world? What problems does the question of the worldliness of the world confront? The constitution of useful things as things at hand has been described as reference. How can world free beings of this kind with regard to their being? Why are these beings encountered first? We mentioned serviceability for, impairment, usability, and so forth, as specific kinds of reference. The what for of serviceability and wherefore of usability prefigure the possible concretion of reference. The indicating of signs, the hammering of the hammer, however, are not qualities of beings. They are not qualities at all, if this term is supposed to designate the ontological structure of a possible determination of things. In any case, things at hand are suited and unsuited for things, and their qualities are, so to speak, still bound up with that suitability or unsuitability, just as objective presence, as a possible kind of being of things at hand, is still bound up with handiness. But as the constitution of useful things, serviceability, reference, is also not the suitability of beings, but the condition of the possibility of being for their being able to be determined by suitability. But then what does reference mean? The fact that the being of things at hand has the structure of reference means that they have in themselves the character of being referred. Beings are discovered with regard to the fact that they are referred, as those beings which they are, to something. They are relevant together with something else. The character of being of things at hand is relevance. Be relevant means to let something be together with something else. The relation of together with is to be indicated by the term reference. Relevance is the being sane of inner-worldly beings, for which they are always already initially free. Beings are in each case relevant. That it has a relevance is an ontological determination of the being of these beings, not an ontic statement about being. What the relevance is about is the what for of serviceability, the wherefore of applicability Verwenbark. The what for of serviceability can in turn be relevant. For example, the thing at hand which we call a hammer has to do with hammering. The hammering has to do with fastening something. Fastening something has to do with protection against bad weather. This protection is, for the sake of providing shelter for Dasein, that is, for the sake of a possibility of its being. Which relevance things at hand have is prefigured in terms of the total relevance. The total relevance which, for example, constitutes the things at hand in a workshop in their handiness is earlier than any single useful thing, as is the farmstead with all its utensils and neighboring land. The total relevance itself, however, ultimately leads back to a what for which no longer has relevance, which itself is not a being of the kind of being of things at hand within a world, but is a being whose being is defined as being in the world, to whose constitution of being worldliness itself belongs. This primary what for is not just another for that as a possible factor in relevance. The primary what for is a for the sake of which, but the for the sake of, which always concerns the being of Dasein, which is essentially concerned about this being itself and its being. For the moment we shall not pursue any further the connection indicated which leads from the structure of relevance to the being of Dasein itself, as the real and unique for the sake of which. Letting something be relevant, first of all, requires a clarification which goes far enough to bring the phenomenon of worldliness to the kind of definiteness needed in order to be able to ask questions about it in general. Ontically, to let something be relevant means to let things at hand be in such and such a way in factical taking care of things, to let them be as they are, and in order that they be such. We grasp the ontic meaning of this letting be in a fundamentally ontological way. Thus we interpret the meaning of the previous freeing of inner-worldly beings initially at hand. Previously letting be does not mean first to bring something to its being and produce it, but rather to discover something that is already a being in its handiness, and thus let it be encountered as the being of this being. Plus or minus this, a priori, letting something be relevant is the condition of the possibility that things at hand be encountered, so that Dasein in its ontic dealings with the beings thus encountered can let them be relevant in an ontic sense. On the other hand, letting something be relevant, understood in an ontological sense, concerns the freeing of everything at hand as a thing at hand, whether it is relevant in the ontic sense, or whether it is such a being which is precisely not relevant ontically. Such a being is one that, initially and for the most part, is taken care of, but which we do not let be as the discovered being it is, since we work on it, improve it, destroy it. Have always already let something be freed for relevance is an a priori perfectal characterizing the kind of being of Dasein itself. Understood ontologically, letting something be relevant is the previous freeing of beings for their inner-worldly handiness. With what of relevance is freed, in terms of the together with what of relevance. It is encountered by heedfulness as this thing at hand. When a being shows itself in general to heedfulness, that is, when a being is discovered in its being, it is always already a thing at hand in the surrounding world and precisely not initially, merely present, world stuff. As the being of things at hand, relevance itself is always discovered only on the basis of a totality of relevance Bewandtnis previously discovered. That is, in the things at hand encountered, what we called the worldly character of things at hand thus lies prediscovered. This totality of relevance previously discovered contains an ontological relation to the world. Letting beings be relevant, and thus freeing them for a totality of relevance, must have already somehow disclosed that for which it is freeing. That for which things at hand in the surrounding world are freed, in such a way that the things at hand first become accessible as inner-worldly beings, cannot itself be understood as a being with the kind of being sane thus discovered. It is essentially not discoverable if we reserve discoveredness and Dekthate as the term for a possibility of being of all beings unlike Dasein. But now what does it mean to say that for which inner-worldly beings are initially freed must previously be disclosed? An understanding of being belongs to the being of Dasein. Understanding has its being in an act of understanding. If the kind of being enthralled essentially belongs to Dasein, then the understanding of being in the world belongs to the essential content of its understanding of being. The previous disclosure of that for which the freeing of things encountered in the world ensues is none other than the understanding of world to which Dasein as a being is always already related. Previous letting something be relevant to, with, is grounded in an understanding of something like letting things be relevant Bewandtnis as well as the in, which and with, which of relevance. These things and what underlies them, such as the what for to which relevance is related, the for the sake of which from which every what for is ultimately derived, all of these must be previously disclosed in a certain intelligibility. And what is that in which Dasein understands itself pre-ontologically as being in the world? In understanding a context of relations, Dasein has been referred to in order to, in terms of an explicitly or inexplicitly grasped potentiality for being sankanon for the sake of which it is, which can be authentic or inauthentic. This prefigures a what for as the possible letting something be relevant, which structurally allows for relevance to something else. Dasein is always in each case already referred in terms of a for the sake of which to the with what of relevant. This means that, insofar as it is, it always already lets beings be encountered as things at hand. That within which Dasein understands itself beforehand in the mode of self-reference is that for which it lets beings be encountered beforehand. As that for which one lets beings be encountered in the kind of being of relevance, the wherein of self-referential understanding is the phenomenon of world. And the structure of that to which Dasein is referred is what constitutes the worldliness of the world. Dasein is primordially familiar with that within which it understands itself in this way. This familiarity with the world does not necessarily require a theoretical transparency of the relations constituting the world as world. However, the possibility of an explicit ontological and existential interpretation of these relations is grounded in the familiarity with the world constitutive for Dasein, which, in its turn, constitutes Dasein's understanding of being. This possibility can be explicitly appropriated when Dasein has set as its task a primordial interpretation of its being, and the possibilities of that being, or, for that matter, of the meaning of being in general. But as yet our analyses have only first laid bare the horizon within which something akin to world and worldliness is to be sought. For our further reflection, we must first make clear how the context of the self-referral of Dasein is to be understood ontologically. Understanding, which will be analyzed with proper penetration in what follows cf. Section 31, holds the indicated relations in a preliminary disclosure. In its familiar being in relevance, understanding holds itself before that disclosure as that within which its reference moves. Understanding can itself be referred to in and by these relations. We shall call the relational character of these referential relations signifying Bedeutung. In its familiarity with these relations, Dacing signifies Bedeutet to itself. It primordially gives itself to understand its being and potentiality of being with regard to its being in the world. The for the sake of which signifies an in order to, the in order to signifies a what for, the what for signifies a what in of letting something be relevant, and the latter a what with of relevance. These relations are interlocked among themselves as a primordial totality. They are what they are as this signifying in which Dasein gives itself to understand its being in the world beforehand. We shall call this relational totality of signification significance Bedeutsamkeit. It is what constitutes the structure of the world, of that in which Dasein as such always already is. In its familiarity with significance, Dasein is the ontic condition of the possibility of the disclosure of beings with the kind of being of relevance, handiness, which are encountered in a world and that can thus make themselves known in their in itself. As such, Dasein always means that a context of things at hand is already essentially discovered with its being. And that it is, Dasein has always already referred itself to an encounter with a world. This dependency upon being referred belongs essentially to its being sane. The significance itself with which Dasein is always already familiar contains the ontological condition of the possibility that Dasein, as understanding and interpreting, can disclose something akin to significations, Bedeutungen, which in turn found the possible being of words and language, plus or minus, as the existential constitution of Dasein, of its being in the world. This disclosed significance is the ontic condition of the possibility for discovering a totality of relevance. If we thus define the being of what is at hand, relevance, and even worldliness itself as a referential context, are we not volatilizing the substantial being of interworldly beings into a system of relations? And since relations are always something thought, are we not dissolving the being of interworldly beings into pure thought? Within the present field of investigation, the repeatedly designated differences of the structures and dimensions of the ontological problematic are to be fundamentally distinguished. 1. The being of the interworldly beings initially encountered, handiness. 2. The being of beings, objective presence, that is found and determined by discovering them in their own right in going through beings initially encountered. 3. The being of the ontic condition of the possibility of discovering interworldly beings in general, the worldliness of the world. This third kind of being is an existential determination of being enthralled, that is, of Dasein. The other two concepts of being are categories and concern beings unlike Dasein. The referential context that constitutes worldliness as significance can be formally understood in the sense of a system of relation. But we must realize that such formalizations level down the phenomena to the extent that the true phenomenal content gets lost, especially in the case of such simple relations as are contained in significance. These relations and relata of the in order to, for the sake of, and with what of relevance resist any kind of mathematical functionalization in accordance with their phenomenal content. Nor are they something thought, something first posited in thinking, but rather relations in which heedful circumspection as such already dwell. As constitutive of worldliness, this system of relations does not volatilize the being of interworldly beings at all. On the contrary, these beings are discoverable in their substantial, in itself, only on the basis of the worldliness of the world. And only when interworldly beings can be encountered at all does the possibility exist of making what is merely objectively present accessible in the field of these beings. On the basis of their merely objective presence, these beings can be determined mathematically in functional concepts with regard to their property. Functional concepts of this kind are ontologically possible only in relation to beings whose being has the character of pure substantiality. Functional concepts are always possible only as formalized substantial concepts. In order to delineate the specific ontological problematic of worldliness still more clearly, the interpretation of worldliness is to be clarified in terms of an extreme counterexample before proceeding with our analysis. B. The contrast between our analysis of worldliness and Descartes' interpretation of the world, our investigation, can secure the concept of worldliness and the structures contained in this phenomenon only step by step. Since the interpretation of the world initially starts with an interworldly being and then never gains sight of the phenomenon of world again, we shall attempt to clarify this point of departure ontologically in what is perhaps its most extreme development. We shall not only give a short presentation of the fundamental features of Descartes' ontology of the world, but also ask about its presuppositions and try to characterize those presuppositions in the light of what has been clarified up to now. This discussion should tell us on what fundamentally undiscussed ontological foundations the interpretations of the world after Descartes, and especially those preceding him, are based. Descartes sees the fundamental ontological determination of the world as extensio. Since extension is a component of spatiality, for Descartes in fact identical with it, and since spatiality is in some sense constitutive of the world, our discussion of the Cartesian ontology of the world, at the same time, offers a negative support for the positive explication of the spatiality of the surrounding world and of Dasein itself. With regard to Descartes' ontology, we shall discuss three things. 1. The determination of the world, as res extensa, section 19. 2. The foundations of this ontological determination, section 20. 3. The hermeneutical discussion of the Cartesian ontology of the world, section 21. The following reflections can be grounded in more detail only by the phenomenological destruction of the cogito sum, cf. Part 2, Division.